discard rates. Has a paradoxical effect on discard rates, in which several standard criteria kidneys may, because of factors like ischemia time and immunological mismatch, may have a greater risk of discard. So this is the harmful labeling effect with standard criteria kidneys because of transplant factors make it a high KDPI and a face rejection. And as I said, older preemptive patients who receive a high KDPI kidney have a better survival in the waiting list than other patients. Also, the KDPI can be used for dual kidney allotment, and there's when the KDRI is greater than 2.2 or the KDPI is greater than 90, dual kidney transplants function better than single kidney transplants. Now, another way that we can evaluate the quality of a deceased donor kidney and decide whether to use it or not use it, or even to do a dual, is to biopsy it. And this concept would apply to, again, depending on the policy of the transplant team, age above 60, history of hypertension, diabetes, significant evidence of atherosclerosis, no normal renal function during hospitalization, and a rising terminal creatinine, and a combination of several of these. Now, this concept was given by Rimuzzi in 1999, where he's given a scoring system where in the biopsy, frozen section biopsy, vessels, glomeruli, tubules, and connective tissue are scored from 0 to 3. And it suggested that anything from 0 to a cumulative score of each of these from 0 to 3 would be a standard criteria kidney and transplanted as a single. 4 to 6 should prompt the consideration for a dual kidney transplant, and anything above 7 would be a fairly poor kidney, which could be discarded. And in 2006, he compared the outcomes of this biopsy practice. And he found that when you're looking at donors above the age of 60, and if you biopsy them, you have similar outcomes with those of younger kidneys. Whereas if you have kidneys older than 60 and you don't biopsy them, you're going to put in a number of fairly poor kidneys and have a 20% higher return to dialysis. So there's a clear benefit in biopsying kidneys and putting them to a formal scoring system. And this is just an example of a frozen section biopsy from an elderly diabetic donor, where you can see a lot of some completely sclerosed glomeruli, in fact, several of them. And this is the kind of graft which will have a high Rimuzzi score and be discarded. Now, briefly, see, you have some kidneys which will work well alone and some that should be discarded, but there's a gray zone in between. And because of this, the concept of dual kidney transplantation came up, which has been around for about 2 decades. We prefer to do it monolaterally, putting them both in the same iliac fossa, which has certain advantages. And numbers have been going up worldwide, especially since Rimuzzi's idea of biopsying kidneys. The various criteria that are given by various bodies for deciding on dual versus single. And our policy of doing dual kidney transplant is to do a monolateral, whereas one kidney goes higher up with the common iliac vessels and the other one lower down. And this allows for quicker surgery and also spares the opposite iliac fossa, because you must remember that you are putting in fairly marginal kidneys. And if they fail, you have the other iliac fossa in which to do a second transplant. And the 2 ureters are then reimplanted in the bladder, either with 2 separate reimplants or as putting them together and putting them into a single tunnel. Now, these were the kidney factors. Also, many donors being elderly have a history of malignancy. UK principles from the safety of blood tissue and organ suggest that some types of cancer may allow transplantation from deceased donors. Again, this must be balanced against the risk of dying without a transplantation. Now, when you think of malignancy, there are basically 4 categories. There's CNS malignancy, non-CNS, present and past. So, and again, these can all be divided into high, intermediate, and low risk. Potential recipients must give informed consent, and this is critical. And at the time of retrieval, it's essential that every effort should be made to look for any other focus of malignancy in the abdominal or chest cavity. So again, absolute contraindications among CNS tumors would be any lymphoma, any secondary brain tumors, and any which have had metastatic spread. Then a number, particularly glioblastoma, have a very high risk and should not be used. Again, you don't have to remember these, but once you have a donor with a history of malignancy, you can look at this list and compare. A number of other CNS tumors have a lower risk of 2%, and these could be used with due consent. These are all taken from Peter Morris's textbook of transplantation. Again, CNS, non-CNS malignancies, of course, any locally advanced or metastatic tumor or any active hematological malignancy will be an absolute contraindication. Majority of melanomas, breast and colon cancers would be contraindications. A renal cell carcinoma of stage 2 and 4 again would be a contraindication, as well as most small cell and lung cancers. Once you come to patients with past cancers, any renal cell carcinoma of stage 1, which had been treated adequately with a 5-year disease-free interval, and low-stage breast cancers with 5 or 10 years of survival would have a low risk of spreading malignancy to the recipient. And again, lower stage breast cancers more than 10 years, low stage colon cancers, kidney cancers, PT1A, which had been treated and with a cancer survival of 3 years, low-grade melanomas and prostate cancers, which have been treated with 5 years survival, could also donate with a low risk of transmission. And already, very minimal risk would be from superficial bladder cancers, small renal masses which had been resected even without a waiting period. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that because it's important. Low risk prostate cancer, which has been cancer-free for 5 years, and other non-melanomatous skin cancers, and in situ cancers such as in situ CA cervix. Now, there was an interesting paper from Australia which looked at the outcomes of transplantation from 43 living and deceased donors who had a small renal mass less than 4 centimeters, in which the mass was excised and the kidney transplanted without waiting. And they found that the survival times were good in all these patients, and they only had 1 local recurrence at 9 years. And this has actually changed practice. And I'll give an example of a deceased donor that we had about 5 years ago, in which on ultrasound, a small nodule was described in the kidney. And at the time of retrieval, we found a 1.5 centimeter renal mass with no evidence of malignancy anywhere else. And we excised this after taking informed consent and transplanted it. And the recipient is well at 5 years with normal creatinine, no evidence of recurrence. Once in a while, we're faced with donors at extreme age, either small infants or geriatric donors above the age of 80 or 90. With infant donors, although the issues of brain death certification, there's no lower limit, and en bloc kidneys may be used and transplanted either to young or even to adult recipients. As far as geriatric donors are concerned, many programs would hesitate to transplant a donor who's above the age of 80. Older kidneys should not go to very young recipients. But again, it depends all on the physiological age. And if you have a robust 90-year-old with adequate renal function, it would be a shame not to use those kidneys, and they could probably be accepted. Often in the course of ICU stay, donors develop a sepsis, which could be in the form of positive bacterial cultures from blood, urine, or central lines, or systemic signs of sepsis like fever and elevated counts. Now, again, one is always concerned about transmission to the recipient. However, there are numerous reports of successful use of such organs. And the recommendations are that the organism should have been identified by adequate cultures. There should be at least 48 hours of culture-specific antibiotic therapy. There should be an improvement in the state of the recipient in the form of reduced fever markers and inotrope support. Again, always, exercise great caution, and consent should be detailed from recipients of such organs. Just quoting a couple of papers here, this paper from China, which looks at 22 livers and 46 kidney from 39 deceased donors with positive blood and central line cultures, only 28% of which had culture-specific antibodies before retrieval, but there was no transmission to recipients. And other papers have also similarly shown that these organs from such donors can be used with proper antibiotic therapy. Other infectious diseases, again, this is from Peter Morris, active meningitis and encephalitis would be a contraindication. And in fact, many years ago at our center, we really burnt our fingers where we did a transplant from a donor with encephalitis of unknown cause. And both recipients finally developed rabies, and both expired with functioning grafts, and all the OT staff had to undergo painful injections. So one should be careful here. Any active bacterial, any intra-abdominal sepsis, of course. Again, B and C, hepatitis, HIV, these used to be strict contraindications, but this is changing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Any active fungal infection and various parasitic infections, which are prevalent in various parts of the world. For example, Chagas disease causes cardiac involvement in South America. These would be contraindications. Now, in the last decade or so, there's been a sea change in the attitude towards deceased donors with hepatitis C. And we know that hepatitis C infection causes liver disease and also various non-liver involvement, including glomerular disease. However, since 2013, the presence of direct-acting agents such as sofosbuvir, ledipasvir, and their congeners have really revolutionized the treatment of hepatitis C, and it's become actually a disease which is 98% curable. Also, there's, especially in the West, there's been the opioid epidemic has led to a large number of drug overdose deaths. And this is among young people who actually have good quality organs, but many of them are hepatitis C positive because of IV drug use. So because of, there have been various trials which have looked at the use of taking deceased donor organs from donors who are HCV positive. The expanded trial looked at 10 transplants from HCV RNA positive donors to uninfected recipients. They were all treated with various direct-acting agents, and none of them had a recurrence of disease at a short follow-up, admittedly. Similarly, the THINKER trial also looked at 20 transplants from HCV positive deceased donors to negative recipients. They all received direct-acting agents. And there was a sustained viral response in all patients at a year's follow-up. Some of them had transient hepatic complications. There have been studies looked at a short course of DAA and giving direct-acting agents, only when RNA was detected. It's highlighted here that there should be excellent consent, and this should ideally be taken at the time of enrollment of the patients and also at the time of transplant. That a certain patient would be willing to receive organs from an HCV positive patient. And OPTN data shows that there's less delayed graft function and similar patient and graft survival among HCV positive donors compared to negative donors. And it's a fairly recent policy. A lot of questions remain. However, the possible recipients who would benefit from those are the ones who are looking at a long time in the waiting list, those who are highly sensitized. And if they get a good matching kidney from a HCV positive donor, they would be well advised to take it. Also, those with dialysis access failures who are likely not to do well for a long time on the waiting list, and recipients down the waiting list who could trade getting an organ from a viremic donor and trade it for a shorter waiting time. Again, active HPV has been a contraindication. However, with widespread immunization of recipients, in a situation where a recipient is very desperate for an organ because of dialysis failures or other thing, HPV, an organ from an HPV positive donor may be transplanted. And this is a case report from JIPMER in India recounting such a case. Again, one would think that HIV positive donors were strictly contraindicated. However, there's literature from around the world. There's 10-year-old literature from South Africa in which HIV positive recipients have received organs from HIV positive donors with good outcomes. And the HOPE trial in the US has looked at 75 transplants of organs into HIV positive recipients, of which 25% of the donors were HIV positive and 50 were negative. And they found no difference in patient to graft survival at 1 year, which suggests that we've actually expanded the criteria for deceased donor organ to individuals with HIV as well. Again, terminal rise of creatinine is a fairly common scenario in any deceased donor program. Kidney injury is fairly frequent among potential donors who have been in the ICU. It's important that we should know the baseline creatinine or the creatinine at admission. And there are several papers which look at the outcome of donors with a terminal creatinine of greater than 2. And this paper from Poland has found no differences in allograft function, graft patient survival, looking at an AKI group versus a non-AKI group when the creatinine was 2. And another paper looks at whether the creatinine continues to rise or fall. And they found that there are similar rates of DGF and nadir creatinine among these two groups. So if there is evidence that there is mild kidney injury, that should not be a contraindication to accepting organs. Okay, so we've talked a lot about some things which may seem very dry, but now let's come to surgical things. The retrieval injuries do happen, and other physiological things can happen during the course of retrieval. So it's very important that at the time of retrieval, the graft should be thoroughly inspected to look for problems and then to evaluate whether these grafts are usable or not, and what needs to be done to make them usable. So it's important to look for parenchymal injuries, vascular injuries, injuries to the ureter, the perfusion of the kidney, and any other pathology that may pop up. And I have just a few examples to illustrate this. And it's rare for retrieval injuries to lead to organ loss. So here's an example of a segmental artery transection that we had recently at our program. This is an obese donor with a lot of perirenal fat. And in the process of retrieval, the scissor of the donor surgeon transected a segmental artery deep in the hilum. Again, this happened after perfusion, so the kidney was well perfused and there's no blue area. If it happened before, it would have been problematic. However, it was possible to do an end-to-end anastomosis using interrupted suture, and this kidney was transplanted and used successfully. We had a donor a few years ago with 2 renal artery aneurysms, and there was reluctance to use these because these were very thinned out. After cutting the artery short, it really would have been too short to transplant. You can see this is a fairly elderly kidney with multiple small cysts. However, after excising the aneurysms, the remains of the renal artery itself was used as a jump graft and anastomosed and used to lengthen the artery back to nearly its normal length. And this was successfully used for a transplant. As you can see, this is a dual transplant with 2 kidneys in the iliac fossa. We once had a kidney which was transected just below the lower pole of the kidney, leading to a very short very short kidney. It would have been difficult to transplant this. However, because the recipient had a normal native ureter, you can see after the clamps open a very short ureter, it was possible to do end-to-side anastomosis of this short donor ureter to the recipient native ureter, and a successful transplant was done. The miscellaneous problems can pop up. This was a donor who had a fairly long ICU stay and a history of sepsis, which had actually responded to antibiotic treatment. But after retrieval, these small multiple nodules were found in the kidney. And on frozen section, they were found to be full of neutrophilic exudates. And these were actually multiple small renal abscesses, and this kidney was discarded. The thing I'd like to highlight here is that it's very important to expose the capsule of the kidney at the time of retrieval. Preferably the time of retrieval, or at least before inducing your recipient, because often these nasty surprises lurk under the surface, and you don't want to be in a situation where you have your recipient opened up and you find that you can't use the kidney. There can be issues about, as I was saying, perfusion can be a problem. So this was a kidney taken from a patient who had a replaced heart valve. And after retrieval, we removed the fat, and we found that the lower pole was completely not perfused. So probably that a valve had thrown out a thrombus, which had embolized the lower pole of the kidney. And this kidney was then discarded. Sometimes you find smaller areas which are hypoperfused, but when they clear up with perfusion afterwards, you can use them. They usually work well. And this is the last slide I have. This is a truly nightmare scenario where you see a kidney which has been completely non-perfused, possibly because of a thrombotic or embolic episode in the ICU stay or during the retrieval. And again, as I like to say, as I like to point out every time, that this kidney is hiding in a thick pannus of fat, and if this fat had not been removed, you'd only have discovered an unusable kidney possibly after your recipient was induced, and then you were benching this. So I think that's an important take-home message. Always inspect your kidney thoroughly, preferably at the time of retrieval, otherwise at least before your recipient is induced. So to summarize, I'd just like to say that careful evaluation of donors should include a history examination and a review of reports. You always balance the needs of the recipient against any possible risk from doing this transplant. And as time has gone by and we've understood more and more about various procedures, and with improving drug therapy and other advances, conditions that were previously contraindications are no longer so. So an understanding of these factors can allow us to use more and more organs and increase the donor pool and thus benefit recipients. So thank you. To answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jamal, for an enlightening talk on deceased donor organ selection. I must here inform everyone that Dr. Jamal is also an accomplished pancreatic transplant surgeon. So he has very high credentials, as Vikas also has. So next, over to you, Dr. Zishan.